Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody comes back, don't they?
Okay, this is The Sweeper by A M Burrage. Now, if you listen to the Classic Ghost Stories podcast, you remember we did one of Burrage's stories called Smee just before Christmas last year, which is good. I think he's a good writer. It's of the period, and it is what it is. This is in Roald Dahl's book of ghost stories, which is a very well curated collection. So given the battery is short, we're just going to crack on. So The Sweeper by A M Burrage. It seemed to Tessa Wynyard that Miss Ludgate's strangest characteristic was her kindness to beggars. This was something more than a little peculiar in nature, which, to be sure, presented a surface like a mountain range of unexpected peaks and valleys, for there was a thin streak of meanness in her. One caught glimpses of it here and there, to be traced a little way and lost, like a thin, elusive vein in a block of marble. One week she would pay the household bills without a murmur. The next she would simmer over them in a mild rage, questioning the smallest item and suggesting the most absurd little economies which she would have been the first to condemn later if Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, had ever taken her at her word. She was rich enough to be indifferent, but old enough to be crotchety. Miss Ludgate gave very sparsely to local charities, and those good busybodies who went forth at different times with subscription lists and tales of good causes often visited her and came empty away. She had plausible, transparent excuses for keeping her purse strings tight. Hospitals should be state-aided. Schemes for assisting the local poor destroyed thrift. We had heathen of our own convert and needed to send no missionaries abroad. Yet she was sometimes overwhelmingly generous in her spasmodic charities to individuals, and her kindness to itinerant beggars was proverbial among their fraternity. Her neighbours were not grateful to her for this, for it was said that she encouraged every doubtful character who came that way. When she first agreed to come on a month's trial, Tessa Wynyard had known that she would find Miss Ludgate difficult, doubting whether she would be able to retain the post of companion, and still more, if she would want to retain it. The thing was not arranged through the reading and answering of an advertisement. Tessa knew a married niece of the old lady, who, while recommending the young girl to her ancient kinswoman, was able to give Tessa hints as to the nature and treatment of the old lady's crotchets. So she came to the house well instructed, and not quite as a stranger. Tessa came under the spell of the house from the moment when she entered it for the first time. She had an ingrained romantic love of old country mansions, and Billingdon Abbots, although nothing was left of the original priory after which it was named, was old enough to be worshipped. It was mainly Jacobean, but some 18th century owner, a devotee of the then fashionable cult of Italian architecture, had covered the facade with stucco and added a pillared portico. It was probably the same owner who had erected a summer house to the design of a Greek temple at the end of a walk between nut bushes, and who was responsible for the imitation ruin to which time had since added the authentic touch, beside the reedy fish pond at the rear of the house. Likely enough, thought Tessa, who knew the period, that same romantic squire was wont to engage an imitation hermit to meditate beside the spurious ruin on moonlight nights. The gardens round the house were well wooded, and thus lent the house itself an air of melancholy and the inevitable slight atmosphere of damp and darkness, and here and there, in the most unexpected places, were garden gods, mostly broken and all in need of scouring. Tessa soon discovered these stone ghosts quite unexpectedly, and nearly always with a leap and tingle of surprise. A noseless Hermes confronted one at the turn of a shady walk. Demeter, minus a hand, stood half hidden by laurels, still keeping vigil for Persephone. A dancing fawn stood poised and caught in the frozen caper by the gate of the walled-in kitchen garden, beside a small stone pond, a satyr leaned from his pedestal, as if waiting for a naiad to break the surface. The interior of the house was at first a little awe-inspiring to Tessa. She loved pretty things, but she was inclined to be afraid of furniture and pictures which seemed to her to be coldly beautiful and conscious of their own intrinsic values. Everything was highly polished, spotless and speckless, and the reception room had an air of state apartments thrown open for the inspection of the public. The hall was square and galleried, and one could look straight up to the top story and see the slanting balustrades of 3 staircases. 2 suits of armour faced one across a parquet floor, and on the walls were 3 or 4 portraits by Lely and Kneller, those once fashionable painters of court beauties whose works have lost favour with collectors of today. The dining room was long, rectangular and severe, furnished only with a Cromwellian table and chairs and a great plain sideboard gleaming with silver candelabra. 2 large 17th century portraits by unknown members of the Dutch school were the only decorations bestowed on the panelled walls, and the window curtains were brown to match the one strip of carpet which the long table almost exactly covered. Less monastic, but also almost as severe and dignified, was the drawing room, in which Tessa spent most of her time with Miss Ludgate. The boudoir was a homelier room, containing such human things as photographs of living people, work baskets, friendly armchairs, and a cosy feminine atmosphere. But Miss Ludgate preferred more often to sit in state in her great drawing room with the portrait of Miss Olivia Ludgate by Gainsborough, the Chippendale furniture, and the cabinet of priceless china. It was as if she realised that she was but the guardian of her treasures, and wanted to have them within sight now that her term of guardianship was drawing to a close. She must have been well over 80, Tessa thought, for she was very small and withered and frail, with that almost porcelain delicacy peculiar to certain very old ladies. Winter and summer she wore a white woolen shawl inside the house, thick or thin according to the season, which matched in colour and to some extent in texture her soft and still plentiful hair. Her face and hands were yellow-brown with the veneer of old age, but her hands were blue-veined, light and delicate, so that her fingers seemed overweighted by the simplest rings. Her eyes were blue and still piercing, and her mouth, once beautiful, was caught up at the corners by puckerings of the upper lip and looked grim in repose. Her voice had not shrilled, and always she spoke very slowly, with an unaffected precision, as one who knew that she had only to be understood to be obeyed, and therefore took care always to be understood. Tessa spent her first week with Miss Ludgate without knowing whether or no she liked the old lady, or whether or no she was afraid of her. Nor was she any wiser with regard to Miss Ludgate's sentiments towards herself. Their relations were much as they might have been had Tessa been a child, and Miss Ludgate a new governess suspected of severity. Tessa was on her best behaviour, doing as she was told, and thinking before she spoke, as children should, and generally do not. At times it occurred to her to wonder that Miss Ludgate had not sought to engage an older woman, for in her cold formality of that first week's intercourse she wondered what gap in the household she was supposed to fill, and what return she was making for her wage and board. Truth to tell, Miss Ludgate wanted to see somebody young about the house, even if she could share with her companion no more than the common factors of their sex and their humanity. The servants were all old retainers, kept faithful to her by rumours of legacies. Her relatives were few and immersed in their own affairs. The house and the bulk of the property from which she derived her income were held in trust for an heir appointed by the same will which had given her a life interest in the estate. It saved her from the transparent attentions of any fortune-hunting nephew or niece, but it kept her lonely and starved for young companionship. It happened that Tessa was able to play the piano quite reasonably well, and that she had an educated taste in music. So had Miss Ludgate, who had been a performer of much the same quality, until the time came when her rebel fingers stiffened with rheumatism. So the heavy grand piano, which had been scrupulously kept in tune, was silent no longer, and Miss Ludgate regained an old, lost pleasure. It should be added that Tessa was 22, and with no pretensions to technical beauty, was rich in commonplace good looks, which were enhanced by perfect health, and the freshness of her youth. She looked her best in candlelight with her slim hands. They at least would have pleased an artist, hovering like white moths over the keyboard of the piano. When she had been with Miss Ludgate a week, the old lady addressed her for the first time as Tessa. She added, "I hope you intend to stay with me, my dear. It will be dull for you, and I fear you will often find me a bother, but I shan't take up all your time, and I dare say you'll be able to find friends and amusements." So Tessa stayed on, and beyond the probationary month, she was a soft-hearted girl who gave her friendship easily but always sincerely. She tried to like everybody who liked her and generally succeeded. It would be hard to analyse the quality of the friendship between the two women, but certainly it existed, and at times they were able to touch hands over the barrier between youth and age. Miss Ludgate inspired in Tessa a queer tenderness. With all her wealth, and despite her domineering manner, she was a pathetic and lonely figure. She reminded Tessa of some poor actress playing the part of queen, wearing the tawdry crown jewels, uttering commands which the other mummers obeyed like automata, while all the while there awaited her the realities of life at the fall of the curtain, the wet streets, the poor meal, and the cold and comfortless lodging. It filled Tessa with pity to think that here, close beside her, was a living, breathing creature still clinging to life, who must, in the course of nature, so soon let go her hold. Tessa could think, 50 years hence I shall be 72, and there's no reason why I shouldn't live till then. She wondered painfully how it must feel to be unable to look a month hence with average confidence, and to regard every nightfall as the threshold of a precarious tomorrow. Tessa would have found life very dull but for the complete change in her surroundings. She had been brought up in a country vicarage, one of 7 brothers and sisters, who had worn one another's clothes, tramped the carpets threadbare, mishandled the cheap furniture, broken everything frangible except their parents' hearts, and had somehow tumbled into adolescence. The unwonted grandeur of living with Miss Ludgate flavoured the monotony. We have her writing home to her darling mother as follows: "I expect when I get back home again, our dear old rooms will look absurdly small. I thought at first that the house was huge, and every room as big as a barrack room. Not that I've ever been into a barrack room, but I'm getting used to it now, and it really isn't so enormous as I thought. Huge compared with ours, of course, but not so big as Lord Branbourne's house or even Colonel Exstead's. Really, though, it's a darling old place, and might have come out of one of those books in which there's a mystery and a sliding panel, and the heroine's a nursery governess who marries the young baronet. But there's no mystery that I've heard of, although I like to pretend there is. And even if I were the nursery governess, there's no young baronet within a radius of miles. But at least it ought to have a traditional ghost, although, since I haven't heard of one, it's probably deficient even in that respect. I don't like to ask Miss Ludgate because, although she's dear, there are questions I couldn't ask her. She might believe in ghosts, and it might scare her to talk about them, or she mightn't, and then she'd be furious with me for talking rubbish. Of course, I know it's all rubbish, but it'd be very nice to know that we were supposed to be haunted by a nice grey lady, of say, about the period of Queen Anne. But if we're haunted by nothing else, we're certainly haunted by tramps. A letter went on to describe the numerous daily visits of those nomads of the English countryside who beg and steal on their way from workhouse to workhouse. Those queer, illogical, feckless beings who prefer the most intense miseries and hardships to the comparative comforts attendant on honest work. 3 or 4 was a day's average of such callers, and not one went empty away. Mrs. Finch had very definite orders, and them out with the impassive face of a perfect subject of discipline. When there was no spare food, there was the pleasanter alternative of money, which would be transformed into liquor at the nearest inn. Tessa was forever meeting those vagrants on the drive, male and female. They differed in 100 ways, some still trying to cling to the last rags of self-respect, others obscene, leering, furtive, potential criminals who lacked the courage to rise above petty theft. Most faces were either evil or carried the rolling eyes and lewd, loose mouth of a semi-idiot, but they were all alike in their personal uncleanliness and in the insolence of their bearing. Tessa grew used to receiving them from direct and insolent challenges of the eyes, familiar nods, blatant grins. In their several ways they told her that she was nobody, and that if she hated to see them, so much the better. They knew she was an underling, subject to dismissal, whereas they, for some occult reason, were always the welcome guests. Tessa resented their presence and their dumb insolence, and secretly raged against Miss Ludgate for encouraging them. They were the sewer rats of society, foul, predatory, and carrying disease from village to village and from town to town. The girl knew something of the struggles of the decent poor. Her upbringing in a country vicarage had given her intimate knowledge of farmhands and builders' labourers, the tragic poverty of their homes, their independence and their gallant struggles for existence. On Miss Ludgate's estate, there was more than one family living on bread and potatoes and getting not too much of either. Yet the old lady had no sympathy for them and gave unlimited largesse to the undeserving. In the ditches outside the park, it was always possible to find a loaf or two of bread flung there by some vagrant who had feasted more delicately on the proceeds of a visit to the tradesman's door. It was not for Tessa to speak to Miss Ludgate on the subject. Indeed, she knew that, in the phraseology of the servants' hall, it was as much as her place was worth. But she did mention it to Mrs. Finch, whose duty was to provide food and drink, or failing those, money. Mrs. Finch, taciturn through her environment, but still with an undercurrent of warmth, replied at first with the one pregnant word, "Orders." After a moment she added, "The mistress has her own good reasons for doing it, or thinks she has." It was late summer when Tessa first took up her abode at Billingdon Abbots, and sweet lavender, that first herald of the approach of autumn, was already blooming in the gardens. September came, and the first warming gleams of yellow showed among the trees. Spiked chestnut husks opened and dropped their polished brown fruit. At evenings the ponds and the trout stream exhaled pale, low-hanging mists. There was a cold snap in the air. By looking from her window every morning, Tessa marked on the trees the inexorable progress of the year. Day by day the green tints lessened as the yellow increased. Then yellow began to give place to gold and brown and red. Only the hollies and the laurels stood fast against the advancing tide. There came an evening when Miss Ludgate appeared for the first time in her winter shawl. She seemed depressed and said little during dinner, and afterwards in the drawing-room, when she had taken out and arranged a pack of patience cards preparatory to beginning her evening game, she suddenly leaned on her elbows and rested her face between her She suddenly leaned on her elbows on the She suddenly leaned her elbows on the table and rested her face between her hands. "Aren't you well, Miss Ludgate?" Tessa asked anxiously. She removed her hands and showed her withered old face. Her eyes were piteous, fear-haunted, and full of shadows. "I am very much as usual, my dear," she said. "You must bear with me. My bad time of the year is just approaching. If I can live until the end of November, I shall last another year, but I don't know yet. I don't know." "Of course you're not going to die this year," said Tessa, with a robust note of optimism which she had found useful in soothing frightened children. "If I don't die this autumn, it'll be the next, or some other autumn," quavered the old voice. "It will be in the autumn that I shall die. I know that. I know that." "But how can you know?" Tessa asked, with just the right note of gentle incredulity. "I know it. What does it matter how I know? Have many leaves fallen yet?" "Hardly any as yet," said Tessa. "There's been very little wind." "They will fall presently," said Miss Ludgate. "Very soon now." Her voice trailed away, but presently she rallied, picked up the miniature playing cards and began her game. 2 days later it rained heavily all the morning and throughout the earlier part of the afternoon. Just as the light was beginning to wane, half a gale of wind sprang up, and showers of yellow leaves, circling and eddying at the wind's will, began to find their way to earth through the level slant of the rain. Miss Ludgate sat watching them, her eyes dull with the suffering of despair, until the lights were turned on and the blinds were drawn. During dinner the wind dropped again and the rain ceased. Tessa afterwards peeped between the blinds to see still silhouettes of trees against the sky and a few stars sparkling palely. It promised after all to be a fine night. As before, Miss Ludgate got out her patience cards, and Tessa picked up a book and waited to be bidden to go at the piano. There was silence in the room save for the intermittent sounds of cards being laid with a snap upon the polished surface of the table and occasional dry rustlings as Tessa turned the pages of her book. When she first heard it, Tessa could not truthfully have said. It seemed to her that she had gradually become conscious of the sounds in the garden outside, and when at last they had so forced themselves upon her attention as to set her wondering what caused them, it was impossible for her to guess but how long they'd actually been going on. Tessa closed the book over her fingers and listened. The sounds were crisp, dry, long drawn out, and rhythmic. There was an equal pause after each one. It was rather like listening to the leisurely brushing of a woman's long hair. What was it? An uneven surface being scratched by something crisp and pliant? Then Tessa knew. On the long path behind the house, which travelled the whole length of the building, somebody was sweeping up the fallen leaves with a stable broom. But what a time to sweep up leaves! She continued to listen. Now that she had identified the sounds, they were quite unmistakable. She would not have had to guess twice had it not been dark outside, and the thought of a gardener showing such devotion to duty as to work at that hour had at first been rejected by her subconscious mind. She looked up, with the intention of making some remark to Miss Ludgate, and she said nothing. Miss Ludgate sat listening intently, her face half turned towards the windows and slightly raised, her eyes upturned. Her whole attitude was one of strained rigidity, expressive of a tension rather dreadful to see in one so old. Tessa not only listened, she now watched. There was a movement in the unnaturally silent room. Miss Ludgate had turned her head and now showed her companion a white face of woe and doom-ridden eyes. Then in a flash her expression changed. Tessa knew that Miss Ludgate had caught her listening to the sounds from the path outside, and that for some reason the old lady was annoyed with her for having heard them. But why? And why that look of terror on the poor white old face? Won't you play something, Tessa? Despite the note of interrogation, the words were an abrupt command, and Tessa knew it. She was to drown the noise of sweeping from outside because, for some queer reason, Miss Ludgate did not want her to hear it. So, tactfully, she played pieces which allowed her to make liberal use of the loud pedal. After half an hour, Miss Ludgate rose, gathered her shawl tighter about her shoulders and hobbled to the door, pausing on the way to say good night to Tessa. Tessa lingered in the room alone and reseated herself before the piano. A minute or two elapsed before she began to strum softly and absent-mindedly. Why did Miss Ludgate object to her hearing that sound of sweeping from the path outside? It had ceased now, or she would have peeped out to see who actually was at work. Had Miss Ludgate some queer distaste for seeing fallen leaves lying about, and was she ashamed because she was keeping a gardener at work at that hour? But it was unlike Miss Ludgate to mind what people thought of her. Besides, she rose late in the morning, and there'd be plenty of time to brush away the leaves before the mistress of the house could set eyes on them. And then, why was Miss Ludgate so terrified? Had it anything to do with her queer belief that she would die in the autumn? On her way to bed, Tess smiled gently to herself for having tried to penetrate to the secret places of a warped mind which was over 80 years old. She had just seen another queer phase of Miss Ludgate, and all of such seemed inexplicable. The night was still calm and promised to so remain. There won't be many more leaves down tonight, Tessa reflected as she undressed. But when next morning she sauntered out into the garden before breakfast, the long path which skirted the rear of the house was still thickly littered with them, and Toy, the second gardener, was busy among them with a barrow and one of those birch stable brooms which in medieval imaginations provided steeds for witches. "Hello!" exclaimed Tessa. "What a lot of leaves must have come down last night." Toy ceased sweeping and shook his head. "No, miss, this here little lot came down with the wind early part of the evening." "But surely they were all swept up. I heard somebody at work here after 9 o'clock. Was it you?" The man grinned. "You catch any of us at work after 9 o'clock, miss?" he said. "No, miss, nobody's touched them till now. It's thankless work, too. Soon as you swept one lot up, there's another waiting. Not 100 men could keep this here garden tidy this time of year." Tessa said nothing more and went thoughtfully into the house. The sweeping was continued on and off all day, for more leaves descended, and a bonfire was built up on the waste ground beyond the kitchen garden and wafted its fragrance over to the house. That evening, Miss Ludgate had a fire made up in the boudoir and announced to Tessa that they would sit there before and after dinner. But it happened that the chimney smoked, and after coughing and grumbling and rating Mrs. Finch on the dilatoriness and inefficiency of sweeps, the old lady went early to bed. It was still too early for Tessa to retire. Having been left to herself, she remembered a book which she had left in the drawing-room, and with which she purposed sitting over the dining-room fire. Hardly had she taken 2 steps past the threshold of the drawing-room when she came abruptly to a halt and stood listening. She couldn't doubt the evidence of her ears. In spite of what Toy had told her, and that it was now after 9:30, somebody was sweeping the path outside. She tiptoed to the window and peeped out between the blinds. Bright moonlight silvered the garden, but she could see nothing. Now, however, that she was near the window, she could locate the sounds more accurately, and they seemed to proceed from a spot farther down the path, which was hidden from her by the angle of the window setting. There was a door just outside the room giving access to the garden, but for no reason that she could name, she felt strangely unwilling to go out and look at the mysterious worker. With the strangest little cold thrill, she was aware of a distant preference for seeing him, for the first time at least, from a distance. Then Tessa remembered a landing window, and after a little hesitation, she went silently and on tiptoe upstairs to the first floor, and down a passage on the left side of the stairhead. Here, moonlight penetrated the window and threw a pale blue screen upon the opposite wall. Tessa fumbled with the window fastenings, raised the sash softly and silently, and leaned out. On the path below her, but some yards to her left and close to the angle of the house, a man was slowly and rhythmically sweeping with a stable broom. The broom swung and struck the path time after time with a soft, crisp swish, and the strokes were as regular as those of a pendulum of a somewhat slow old clock. From her angle of observation, she was unable to see most of the characteristics of the figure underneath. It was that of a working man, but there was something in the silhouette subtly suggestive of old and baggy clothes. But apart from all else, there was something queer, something odd and unnatural in the scene in which she gazed. She knew that there was something lacking, something that she should have found missing at the first glance, yet for all her life she couldn't have said what it was. From below, some gross omission blazed up at her, and though she was acutely aware that the scene lacked something which she had every right to expect to see, her senses groped for it in vain, although the lack of something which should have been there and was not was as obvious as the burning pyre at midnight. She knew that she was watching the gross defiance of some natural law, but what law she didn't know. Suddenly, sick and dizzy, she withdrew her head. All the cowardice in Tessa's nature urged her to go to bed, to forget what she had seen, and to refrain from trying to remember what she had not seen. But the other Tessa, the Tessa who despised cowards and was herself capable under pressure of rising to great heights of courage, stayed and urged. Under her breath, she talked to herself, as she always did when any crisis found her in a state of indecision. "Tessa, you coward! How dare you be afraid? Go down at once and see who it is and what's queer about him. He can't eat you." So the 2 Tessas imprisoned in the one body stole downstairs again, and the braver Tessa was angry with the common heart for thumping so hard and trying to weaken her. But she unfastened the door and stepped out into the moonlight. The sweeper was still at work, close to the angle of the house, nearby where the path ended and a green door gave entrance to the stable yard. The path was thick with leaves, and the girl, advancing uncertainly with her hands up to her breasts, saw that he was making little progress with his work. The broom rose and fell and audibly swept the path, but the dead leaves lay fast and still beneath it. Yet it was not this she had noticed from above. There was still that unseizable something missing. Her footfalls made little noise on the leaf-strewn path, but they became audible to the sweeper while she was still half a dozen yards from him. He paused in his work and turned and looked at her. He was a tall, lean man with a white, cadaverous face and eyes that bulged like huge rising bubbles as they regarded her. It was a foul, suffering face which he showed to Tessa, a face whose misery could and did inspire loathing and a hitherto unimagined horror, but never pity. He was clad in the meanest rags, which seemed to have been cast at random over his emaciated body. The hands grasping the broom seemed no more than bones and skin. He was so thin, thought Tessa, that he was almost... And here she paused in thought, because she found herself hating the word which tried to force itself into her mind. But it had its way and blew in on a cold wind of terror. Yes, he was almost transparent, she thought, and sickened at the word, which had come to have a new and vile meaning for her. They faced each other through a fraction of eternity, not to be measured by seconds, and then Tessa heard herself scream. It flashed upon her now, the strange, abominable detail of the figure which confronted her, the something missing which she had noticed without actually seeing from above. The path was flooded with moonlight, but the visitant had no shadow. Passed upon this vile discovery, she saw dimly through it, the ivy stirring upon the wall. Then, as unbidden thoughts rushed to tell her that the thing was not of this world, and it was not holy, so she was left suddenly and dreadfully alone. The spot where the thing had stood was empty, save for the moonlight and the shallow litter of leaves. Tessa had no memory of returning to the house. Her next recollection was of finding herself in the hall, faint and gasping and sobbing. Even as she approached the stairs, she saw a light dancing on the wall above and wondered what fresh horror was to confront her. But it was only Mrs. Finch coming downstairs in a dressing gown, candle in hand, an incongruous but a very comforting sight. "Oh, it's you, Miss Tessa," said Mrs. Finch, reassured. She held the candle lower and peered down at the sobbing girl. "Why, whatever is the matter? Oh, Miss Tessa, Miss Tessa. You've never been outside, have you?" Tessa sobbed and choked and tried to speak. I've seen. Mrs. Finch swiftly descended the remaining stairs and put an arm around the shuddering girl. "Hush, my dear, I know what you've seen. You didn't ought never to have gone out." "I've seen it once too, but only once, thank God." "What is it?" Tessa faltered. "Never you mind, my dear. Now, don't be frightened. It's all over now. He doesn't come here for you. It's the mistress he wants. You've nothing to fear, Miss Tessa. Where was he when you saw him?" "Close to the end of the path near the stable gate." Mrs. Finch threw up her hands. "Oh, the poor mistress. Her time's shortening. The end's nigh now." "I can't bear any more," Tessa sobbed, and then she contradicted herself, clinging to Mrs. Finch. "I must know. I can't rest until I know. Tell me everything." "Come into my parlour, my dear, and I'll make a cup of tea. We can both do with it, I think. But you'd best not know, at least not tonight." "I must," whispered Tessa, "if I'm ever to have any peace." The fire was still burning behind a guard in the housekeeper's parlour, for Mrs. Finch had only gone up to bed for a few minutes since. There was water still warm in the brass kettle, and in a few minutes the tea was ready. Tessa sipped and felt the first vibrations of her returning courage, and presently looked inquiringly at Mrs. Finch. "I'll tell you, Miss Tessa," said the old housekeeper, "if it'll make you any easier. But don't let the mistress know, as I've ever told you." Tessa inclined her head and gave the required promise. "You don't know why," Mrs. Finch began in a low voice, "the mistress gives to every beggar, deserving or otherwise. The reason comes into what I'm going to tell you. Miss Ludgate wasn't always like that, not until up to about 15 years ago. She was old then, but active for her age and very fond of gardening. Late one afternoon in the autumn, when she was cutting some late roses, a beggar came to the tradesman's door. Sick and ill and starved he looked, but there, You've seen him. He was a bad lot, we found out afterwards, but I was sorry for him. And I was just going to risk giving him some food without orders when up comes Miss Ludgate. "What's this?" she says. He whined about not being able to get work. "Work," said the mistress. "You don't want work, you want charity. If you want to eat," she says, "you shall, but you should work first. There's a broom," she says, "and there's a path littered with leaves. Start sweeping up at the top, and when you come to the end, you can come and see me." Well, he took the broom, and a few minutes later I heard a shout from Miss Ludgate with her come hurrying out. There was a man lying at the top of the path where he'd commenced sweeping, and he'd collapsed and fallen down. I didn't know then, but he was dying. But he did, and he gave Miss Ludgate a look as I shall never forget. "When I've swept to the end of the path," he says, "I'll come for you, my lady, and we'll feast together. Only see as you're ready to be fetched when I come." Those were his last words. He was buried by the parish, and it gave Miss Ludgate such a turn that she ordered something to be given to every beggar who came, and not one of them to be asked to do a stroke of work. But next autumn, when the leaves began to fall, he came back and started sweeping, right at the top of the path, round about where he died. We've all heard him, and most of us have seen him. Year after year he's come back and swept with his broom, which just makes a brushing noise and hardly stirs a leaf. But each year he's been getting nearer and nearer to the end of the path. And when he gets right to the end, well, I wouldn't like to be the mistress with all her money. It was 3 evenings later, just before the hour fixed for dinner, that the sweeper completed his task. That is to say, if one reposes literal belief in Mrs. Finch's story. The servants heard somebody burst open the tradesman's door, and having rushed out into the passage, 2 of them saw that the door was open, but found no one there. Miss Ludgate was already in the drawing room, but Tessa was still upstairs dressing for dinner. Presently Mrs. Finch had occasion to enter the drawing room to speak to her mistress, and her screams warned the household of what had happened. Tessa heard them just as she was ready to go downstairs, and she rushed into the drawing room a few moments later. Miss Ludgate was sitting upright in her favourite chair. Her eyes were open, but she was quite dead, and in her eyes there was something that Tessa couldn't bear to see. Withdrawing her own gaze from that fixed state of terror and recognition, she saw something on the carpet, and presently stooped to pick it up. It was a little yellow leaf, damp and pinched and frayed, and but for her own experience and Mrs. Finch's tale, she might have wondered how it had come to be there. She dropped it, shuddering, for it looked as if it had been picked up by, and had afterwards fallen from, the birch twigs of a stable broom.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?